Hello, BookTube. This is Jack, the Rambling Raconteur. And for those of you in the United States, happy Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I'm a teacher, so I have the day off. And I wanted to just put out a little, I don't want to use the word challenge, but put out an idea that if you've never read any of Dr. King's work, it's really fantastic. I wanted to speak just briefly about the final speech, sermon speech, kind of gets mixed up in both, that he delivered, the famous I've Been to the Mountaintop sermon. And I live in Arizona. I was actually born here, grew up in Arizona in the southwestern United States. And this is a state where, for a period of time, it was one of the only places in the country that did not celebrate a Martin Luther King holiday. And there were real questions around, was that due to racism? Was it due to the authority of a governor to declare those kinds of holidays? And I think my personal opinion from looking at what the governor at the time was trying to do in not having a holiday, it absolutely had to do with race. But I think Dr. King sometimes gets a shrift as a really great motivational speaker almost. That he was in the tradition of rural itinerant preachers who could just speak off the top of their head and go with the flow or go where the Spirit moved him. And I think that really does a disservice to him. If you've never read the I've Been to the Mountaintop sermon, it really shows how deep his learning is, what a incredible thinker he was. And so I want to bring you a few passages from that, and then close with his famous final lines, and just leave that as an opportunity. If you've never experienced any of his work, it really does. It speaks to our minds. It speaks to our hearts. It speaks to our soul. It pushes us to reconsider what we're doing and the purpose that we have in each action. And so the sermon speech is widely available. It was really the last thing last public statement he had. He was murdered the very next day. So the sermon I've Been to the Mountaintop was delivered on April 3rd, 1968. He was murdered on April 4th. And he had been in Memphis to organize a strike supporting sanitation workers. And the copy I have is from the Library of America volume, American Sermons. It's the final speech or sermon that's in the text. And it's interesting, the flyleaf says, the sermon is the first and most enduring genre of American literature. And it goes on from there to talk about the many different forms that religion in the United States took, and sort of as a anthology culminates with some of the famous 20th century speakers, and the final one is Dr. King. And so he starts out, and again, I think sometimes Martin Luther King is regarded as someone who was, he's famous for his nonviolence, but he's not famous for his education, and he was an incredibly well-read, intelligent person, and that comes out very quickly. And he begins, "Thank you very kindly, my friends. I listened to Ralph Abernathy in his eloquent and generous introduction, and then thought about myself. I wondered who he was talking about. It's always good to have your closest friend and associate say something good about you, and Ralph is the best friend that I have in the world. I'm delighted to see each of you here tonight in spite of a storm warning. You reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. As you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of general and panoramic view of the whole history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, 'Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in?' I would take my mental flight by Egypt, through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality." And I just want to pause right there. Anyone who ever thought that Martin Luther King was not an intelligent person, a person who was deeply immersed in the I don't want to say the canon, but the traditions of civilization, and who understood culture, who understood history, I guess my challenge is this: how many people would know who Aristophanes was today? How many people were aware of Aristophanes even back in 1968. And he's showing in very simple ways just what a deep thinker he is. He goes through, over the next 2 pages, he really lists a whole variety of places that are important moments in history. He talks about Martin Luther in Wittenberg nailing up his 95 Theses. He talks about 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation. He talks about the Great Depression. He talks about all those things with an authority and an intelligence that is so profound. And he goes on and he talks about very specific moments of his own personal life. It's amazing that, in a sense, he almost delivers his own eulogy, talking about how all of the different events that have occurred in his life and in the lives of those around him and in the different movements he's been a part of, and how each of them is really part of this long stream of movement that begins way, way back at the beginning of humanity and has not reached its culmination yet. And of course, he would not live to see its culmination. He knows that. He talks very specifically about how he had been stabbed and in a previous assault, and how if he had sneezed before he had been able to get to the hospital, he would have lost so much blood that he would have died. And he lists the different things that would have happened if he had sneezed, and how he received a letter from I believe it was a high school student, a 9th grade student, who had said, "I should like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I am simply writing to you to say that I am so happy that you didn't sneeze." And he goes on and says, "And I want to say tonight, I want to say that I am happy that I didn't sneeze. Because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960, when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream." And his ability to encapsulate private moments and make them as little waves in the tide of history that is just going to carry forward is astonishing. There's almost no one within history who writes and thinks and speaks the way that he does, with such a combination of education and emotion, and it's so natural. And then, of course, he closes with his famous final paragraph. And he goes, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountaintop. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And that's the final words of Martin Luther King. And it absolutely speaks to every single human being in the world, every single person throughout civilization. He had said in another context that the arc of history bends towards justice. And as a science teacher, I'll add, these are sort of my only words that aren't, Dr. King's ideas in this video, is that the reason that arcs exist, that anything bends in an arc, is because there's a central force pulling it and exerting a force on that object to bend it. The Earth curves because of the gravitational force of the sun. Rockets and object, a thrown ball on Earth curve because of the gravitational force of the Earth. And the only thing that creates an arc in history bending towards justice is a force exerted by people's actions and choices. And so, as I say, happy Martin Luther King holiday in the U.S. and around the world. I would also say, let's all just be thinking about the purpose behind every one of our choices, the purpose behind our words and our actions, and let those all be in a purpose that grounds towards justice and that grounds towards freedom. So, thank you, BookTube.